A central belief of Christianity is that Jesus died by crucifixion and then rose 3 days later. But is it possible this is all wrong? Jesus didn't resurrect. Instead, he survived and lived a long life after. Some did see Jesus alive after the crucifixion, and they interpreted it as if he rose from the dead. But the reality was he actually survived. Although there are some religious movements that hold to this hypothesis, it is riddled with problems, which is why the overwhelming consensus of scholars reject this idea. When we look at the data, there is absolutely no way Jesus could have survived the torture of the cross. Despite what mainstream Islamic beliefs suggest, there is no doubt that Jesus was crucified. All of our early sources that speak on what happened to Jesus attest to the crucifixion, including some non-Christian sources as well. It isn't until the 2nd century that we see some of the Gnostic groups doubting the crucifixion, and they did so because of theological motives. Since they didn't believe Jesus was human, they could not believe that he would suffer like we do, so they denied that he was crucified, and instead argued a substitute was offered in his place. Given that the crucifixion was such a central aspect to the story of Jesus, it appears Gnostics still had to account for it by coming up with substitution theories. This shows us the crucifixion was so widely accepted that those who would come to deny it still had to account for it with speculative theories about a substitute being made to appear like Jesus. But there is no early evidence for this belief. All of the 1st century evidence says it was Jesus who was crucified. However, there are some who think Jesus survived the crucifixion. This is called the Swoon Theory, which is the belief that on the cross, Jesus went into a coma-like state and was revived in the tomb. The Ahmadi sect of Islam, which is considered heretical by most Muslims, holds to the Swoon Theory and that Jesus went to India after and lived a long life. Barbara Thering is one of the few scholars that has advocated that Jesus survived the crucifixion and then revived in the tomb. She speculates that he even continued to preach in the region and later converted the Apostle Paul directly. But the Swoon Theory suffers from innumerable problems. First, even non-Christian sources attest that Jesus died. The letter of Mara ben Serapium says that Jesus was murdered. The Talmud says Jesus was executed, and Josephus said Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. All of our Christian sources from the 1st century that speak of what happened to Jesus report that he died. Bart Ehrman says, that Jesus died by crucifixion is almost universally attested in our sources, early and late. We have traditions of Jesus' bloody execution in independent gospel sources, throughout our various epistles, in other writings, and certainly in Paul, everywhere in Paul. It is widely recognized by scholars that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul cites an early creed which reports that Jesus died. Gerald O'Collins reports the majority of scholars date this creed to the 30s, which places it a few years after Jesus died. The reasons are, Paul says he received it from others, and spoke about it in a rabbinic way of a teacher passing on important teachings to students. The likely source would be the apostles he spoke with, which are mentioned in the letter to the Galatians. It is formed in a mnemonic structure with parallelism, which suggests it was a creed of the early church. It is also less than 50 words, and this suggests it was used for catechizing new Christians. It calls Peter by his Aramaic name, Kepas, which suggests the creed was early, and it has independent traditions not contingent on the Gospels, like the appearance to James and the independent appearance to Peter. Mike Lacona says, there is likewise widespread agreement that it was composed very early and may very well be the oldest extant tradition pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus. So within a few years, the early church was reporting Jesus died and rose from the dead. This data alone is enough to convince the overwhelming majority of scholars that Jesus died on the cross. Gerd Ludemann says, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan said, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Paula Fredrickson said, The single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate, on or around Passover, in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. Despite this, some are still not convinced. Ahmadis argue that in the Gospels we have evidence that Jesus survived the crucifixion. They claim Jesus said he would not die when he spoke of the sign of Jonah. Jesus said he would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, just like Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights. But the common belief is Jonah was alive for that time. So according to Ahmadis, Jesus should have been alive as well. They also argue that John reported blood and water came out of Jesus' side. If he had actually died, his heart should have stopped, the blood would have congealed, and water and blood should not have come out of him. So this is evidence Jesus was alive, when everyone thought he was dead. Additionally, they argue that crucifixion was a long, grueling process that sometimes would last for days. But the Gospels report Jesus died within a few hours. Even Pilate was shocked by this, telling us that this was unusual. So their argument is Jesus could not have died so fast. But they are overlooking some important details. The first argument is quote mining. If we're going to include the words of Jesus, he said time and time again that he was going to die, and after the resurrection, he said he rose from the dead. And we have verses that report Jesus died on the cross. When he spoke of the sign of Jonah, he never explicitly said he would survive the crucifixion. Ahmadis have read that into the passage. But we have numerous places where Jesus explicitly says he will die. If anything, the sign of Jonah should be read in context with these very clear verses. Also, the sign of Jonah is not that Jesus would be alive like Jonah, but that he would be gone for 3 days. If the sign of Jonah was that he would remain alive, it would have been stated like, "For just as Jonah was alive in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be alive in the heart of the earth." But he didn't say that. His comparison to Jonah is not that he will share all the same ontological aspects with Jonah's experience, but that he'll be gone for the same length of time. There is no way we can read the sign of Jonah as suggesting Jesus would survive the crucifixion. Some push back and say if Jesus died on Friday and rose on Sunday, that would not be 3 days. So therefore that's not comparable to Jonah's time length. But this objection is a case of applying our own cultural understanding of time onto the ancient Jewish culture. Saying 3 days and 3 nights could refer to a period that was less than 72 hours, and could refer to a period of Friday to Sunday. Rabbi Eleazar ben Azara said, "A day and a night are an ona, a portion of time, and a portion of an ona is as the whole of it." In other words, you can speak of a portion of a day as the whole. Esther said she would fast for 3 days and 3 nights before going to the king, but then we read she went to the king on the 3rd day, not the 4th. In Matthew 27, the Pharisees report that Jesus said he would rise after 3 days, but they only request the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day. Harty France says, the different phrasing of the 3-day period compared with the 3rd day of Matthew 16:21, 17:23, 20:19, 27:64, and the after 3 days of Matthew 27:63 is due to the Septuagint wording. But in the Semitic inclusive time reckoning, these do not denote different periods, as the pedantic Western reading would suggest. So the sign of Jonah does not entail that Jesus had to remain in the tomb for 72 hours. Additionally, it is not clear that Jonah was actually alive through his ordeal. Brant Petrie draws attention to Jonah chapter 2, where Jonah cries out from the belly of Sheol and the pit, which are terms for the realm of the dead. Jonah says his soul, nephesh, fainted within him, which is another way of saying that he died. Scott Nogel has pointed out it is unlikely the book of Jonah is trying to claim that Jonah was swallowed by a literal fish, but instead the personification of watery chaos, which in the Bible is called Leviathan, or the great fish. So the book of Jonah is saying the ocean swallowed him up, he died, and then God resuscitated him. So even if the sign of Jonah referred to Jesus sharing the same status as Jonah, which it doesn't necessarily, one could still make an argument that Jonah died and came back to life, which parallels the account of Jesus dying and rising from the dead. Next, when we study the narratives in the Gospels of the torture that Jesus endured, there is no way he could have survived. Medical doctors Joseph Bergeron and Frederick Zugby have written books on this topic and point out the facts laid out in the Gospels confirm that Jesus died on the cross. First, his torture didn't begin at Golgotha. He was arrested the night before, beaten by the soldiers of the Sanhedrin, scourged, then beaten by Roman soldiers, had a crown of thorns on his head, and then he had to carry his cross to Golgotha, all without food and liquid. Remember, Jesus was so severely tortured that he could not even carry his cross all the way. It was expected of those condemned to carry their own crosses, but Jesus could not, which tells you he was already badly beaten, which contributed to a quicker death. It is true that sometimes crucifixion would last for days, but if the victim suffered in other ways beforehand, that would lead to a quicker death. Seneca the Younger remarked that crucified victims would have many excuses for dying even before mounting the cross. So depending on what torture occurred beforehand, they could have died within hours. The Jewish soldiers would have inflicted a severe beating on Jesus, given that he claimed he is God, which was considered blasphemy. Then Jesus was scourged. It is unlikely the Roman soldiers, who were known for being anti-Semitic, would have gone easy on him, and they would have scourged him all over. Seneca the Elder said scourging caused deep wounds and lacerated the flesh. Eusebius said scourging resulted in the innermost veins, arteries, and inward parts of the body being exposed. This could easily have resulted in death for many. David McClister said, "Scourging was not normally a form of execution, but it certainly was brutal enough to be fatal in many cases. A person certainly could be beaten to death by the scourge, if that was desired. Its purpose was not only to cause great pain, but to humiliate as well." Joseph Bergeron notes scourging and blunt trauma to the chest area can cause injury to the lungs, with blood and fluid collecting within lung tissue. A lung can also collapse, which is called pneumothorax. To quote, "Jesus was in a weakened condition from the effects of multiple beatings, fluid deprivation, and blood loss. More likely than not, he was in early stages of shock prior to being lifted onto the cross." Bergeron goes on to note, this is the most likely cause of Jesus' death. He would have suffered from traumatic hemorrhagic shock. This is caused by decreased circulating blood volume as a result of injury and bleeding. Extreme thirst can also occur during shock, which would correlate to Jesus saying he thirsts on the cross. Shock can occur when blood loss passes 10%. At 45% blood volume loss, reduction in blood return to the heart, and decreased resistance in the body's blood vessels will cause the blood pressure to drop to zero. The effects of shock lead to cellular deterioration in multiple organs and tissue. But also, in 2003, researchers noted that shock and blood loss can lead to the body losing its ability to clot blood, which is known as trauma-induced coagulopathy. Bergeron says, "Patients with more extensive injuries have greater risk of developing coagulopathy because the extent and degree of tissue injury is a major trigger. Injured endothelial cells, i.e. cells that line blood vessels, initiate the clotting mechanisms. With diffuse injury and widespread activation, the blood clotting mechanisms, necessary blood cells and chemical factors can be depleted and cause an imbalance between the blood's ability to clot and dissolve unnecessary clots." Putting all this together, we can see that Jesus was severely beaten by the Jewish soldiers. Then he was handed over to the Romans and scourged, and they would have scourged his whole body, leading to massive blood loss. But even after that, the Gospels report he was again beaten by Roman soldiers and had a crown of thorns placed on his head, which would have caused even more blood loss. Frederick Zugby says, "The pain would have lancinated across the sides of his face and deep into his ears. Bleeding would have resulted from penetrating small blood vessels. The pain may have stopped almost abruptly, only to recur the slightest movement of the jaws or even from a wisp of wind. The traumatic shock from the brutal scourging would have been further enhanced by the paroxysmal pains across the face." Given this torture, we can infer Jesus was already in the early stages of shock. He could not even carry his cross to Golgotha, which was expected. This torture would have prevented his blood from clotting, and the injuries he suffered would have resulted in fluid building up around his lung, and most likely would have caused a collapsed lung. Thus, the logical conclusion is Jesus went into shock on the cross and died. Furthermore, let's just say by amazing luck he was not dead at this point and only unconscious. A soldier then shoved a spear into his side. Given it was their job to assure their victims were dead before the bodies were removed, we can reasonably infer they aimed to pierce the heart. If you saw someone severely beaten, scourged from head to toe, then beaten again, then nailed to a cross, then had a spear shoved into their side, you could easily conclude they were dead, and no amount of ancient healing methods would revive someone from this much blood loss. Josephus reported that after the destruction of Jerusalem, he saw 3 of his friends on crosses and begged Titus to take them down. Titus did so in order they be given the best medical treatment of the day. Even with that, only one managed to survive. Jesus was not given the best medical treatment, and instead, after suffering insurmountable torture, he had a spear shoved into his side. It doesn't take a lot to realize that he died. A Roman soldier would forfeit his own life if he let a prisoner escape alive. He would have shoved that spear in far enough to pierce the heart to verify that Jesus was dead. Moreover, these soldiers would have been trained to kill. They knew when someone was dead, and the early sources agree with this assessment. Jesus died on the cross. Joseph Bergeron says, to suggest that Jesus did not die when crucified is untenable. Moreover, to assure that Jesus was dead, a Roman soldier delivered the coup de grace of plunging a spear into Jesus' chest, collapsing his lung and rupturing his heart. An article from the Journal of the American Medical Association stated, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical research. So when John saw blood and water come out of his side, this would be expected if Jesus had died from shock. The blood could not clot, and the spear that pierced his side would have unleashed the clear fluid from his lungs and blood as well. Frederick Zugby says, I have investigated over 25,000 deaths and have performed over 10,000 autopsies over 34 years during my tenure as Chief Medical Examiner of Rockland County, New York, and I have seen that blood commonly flows out of the wounds of dead bodies, particularly in victims of violent death. Blood remains unclotted in most victims of violent death because of the increase in certain chemical factors in blood called thrombolysins, which have the ability to dissolve clots. What is interesting is the early church father Origen considered the blood and water coming out of Jesus to be supernatural because he, like Archimedes today, thought the blood should have clotted or congealed. John even felt the need to interrupt the narrative to assure his audience this was something he witnessed, because he probably understood that most dead bodies would not bleed. But modern medical research indicates this would have been a natural result from a victim who suffered from severe beatings and shock. So it is unlikely John made this up. It's probably something he witnessed. Frederick Zugby says, if I were to certify the cause of Jesus' death in my official capacity as medical examiner, the death certificate would read as follows. Cause of death, cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion. Even if Jesus survived after the deadly beatings, blood loss, and the spear going into his side aiming for his heart, he was placed in a tomb for 3 days, where he was given no medical attention, no food, and no water. Without liquid and food, there would have been no way for the body to heal after such severe torture. There is no indication in the Gospels that Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea were trying to heal Jesus. They were there to prepare his body with traditional Jewish burial customs. The mixture of myrrh and aloe was used to diminish the stench of a rotting corpse. It was not for preserving a corpse or attempting to revive a dying man. Frederick Zugby says, aloes and myrrh have some minor antiseptic and analgesic effects, but wouldn't begin to be of any value when one considers the extent of Jesus' injuries. Craig Keener says, when spices were used, they were important, not to preserve the corpse, but to diminish the stench and in practice, to pay final respects to the deceased. Unless by a miracle, we would not expect Jesus to come out of the tomb alive. And if we have to posit a miracle, then let's go with what Jesus said. He died and was resurrected. Additionally, the Gospels report Jesus was walking around after the resurrection. If he did not die, and instead was naturally reviving in the tomb, this would have been impossible. Zugby says, the penetration of his feet with large 12-centimeter long spikes would have caused massive swelling and exquisite pain and tenderness beginning in the first hour or so on the cross and continuing in progressive severity. Over the next 2 days, the feet would have been massively swollen and badly infected beyond the immediate healing capability of any therapy. Jesus wouldn't have been able to stand or walk on his feet for at least a month, if not longer. In other words, Jesus would not have been seen as a resurrected man, but as a half-dead corpse, crawling around begging for water. There is absolutely no way anyone would have thought he had been resurrected, which is the belief we find in the Gospels, not that he survived the crucifixion. No one seems to have posited that until centuries later. So the evidence clearly indicates Jesus died on the cross. All the early sources report this. Jesus himself confirms this, and there is no way anyone could have survived the torture that Jesus endured. Attempts to quote mine the Gospels to argue Jesus survived fail for multiple reasons. On the cross, Jesus died. If it is true the disciples saw him alive on Easter morning, the only logical conclusion one could draw is that he was raised from the dead. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.